It took exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds for Linda Rose's smile to falter, her gaze to narrow, and her posture to shift from hospitality to suspicion. Julian Reed had just stepped into the Regalis first-class lounge at Denver International Airport. His tailored navy suit caught the cabin lights just right. His movements were unhurried, his presence unmistakable, the kind that made silence ripple softly through a room. And yet, to Linda, the gate attendant behind the polished marble podium, he didn't belong. She didn't say it, not directly, but her body did. Her sudden straightening, her fingers tightening on the tablet, the subtle lean toward the security earpiece tucked discreetly under her graying hair. Julian had seen it all before. He handed over his boarding pass and ID with the same grace he'd use in a boardroom. But Linda didn't look at the documents, not at first. She looked at him, and just beneath her breath, almost a whisper, "Security. Code 5. From the far side of the lounge, 2 uniformed officers began moving. Not running, not aggressive, just purposeful. Casual even, like this sort of thing happened all the time. And maybe for them, it did. Julian stood motionless as they approached. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He could feel the other passengers watching, or rather pretending not to. A businessman in a golf shirt shifted awkwardly behind his newspaper. A woman in pearls clutched her purse just a little tighter. No one spoke. No one intervened. Eyes flickered up, then down again, like window blinds catching the breeze. But one pair of eyes didn't look away. Andre Hill, 21 years old, barely 2 weeks into his internship with Regalis Airways, stood frozen behind the glass divider near the concierge desk. His mouth parted slightly as recognition set in. Julian Reed. The Julian Reed. Founder of Reed Core Systems, architect of half the biometric software that powered this very terminal. A name whispered in classrooms, quoted in case studies, held up as legend by black students in tech programs across the country. And here he was, being escorted out like a fraud. Linda didn't look pleased, but she didn't look surprised either. Julian, for his part, offered her no reaction, no protest, no raised voice, no demand to speak to a manager. He adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, checked the time on his wrist, understated elegance, and as the officers gently, professionally asked him to step aside for a quick verification, Julian reached into his coat pocket. Not for a wallet, not for his ID again, but for something far more powerful, his phone. He unlocked it with a glance, pressed a secure, silent button, and spoke just loud enough for only one person to hear. "Activate Protocol Eclipse." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Because while Linda was busy verifying that he didn't belong, while Andre's heart pounded in disbelief, while the lounge returned to its low hum of espresso machines and soft jazz, somewhere, in a control room miles away, something had been triggered. A process, a signal, a reckoning. What they didn't know was that the man they tried to silence had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Before there were algorithms, before encrypted calls and platinum cufflinks, there was a boy with eyes too old for his age, and a notebook, filled with numbers no one understood. Julian Reed was 10 when the world stopped calling him son. One moment, he was dozing in the back seat of his parents' car, his head against the window. The next, sirens, shattered glass, silence. After the accident, there were no grandparents, no relatives who stayed, just the state, and a cold, gray sign that read, St. Gabriel's Foster Home. He didn't cry when they took him in. He didn't speak much either. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the others drifted into restless sleep, Julian sat on the edge of his bunk, pencil in hand, scribbling figures into a frayed spiral notebook. He wasn't doing homework. He was building a shield made of patterns, probabilities, and perfectly plotted loops. If he could predict the chaos, maybe he could survive it. To the other boys, he was a freak, too quiet, too serious, too smart, and in this place, that wasn't a compliment. They mocked him, shoved him. Once, someone tore his notebook in half. He taped it back together without a word. One rainy afternoon, as the clouds pressed low and the yard turned to mud, Julian sat outside on the cracked stone steps, sketching diagrams in silence. Miss Carter, his caseworker, stepped out and sat beside him. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't scold him for being outside in the drizzle. She just watched. And then softly asked, "Julian, what are you working on?" He didn't look up. "It's a pattern," he murmured. "If I can map out the steps, I can tell what happens next." Her eyes drifted over the page, full of arrows, loops, symbols, even she couldn't name. "Why do you want to know what's next?" He hesitated. Then, without lifting his gaze, said quietly, "Because when you see it coming, it doesn't hurt as much." The breath caught in her throat. She was trained not to react, but for a moment, just one heartbeat, her hand reached for his, and stayed there. A few years later, after yet another move to yet another foster home, Julian came home from school, tossed his backpack to the floor, and stared out the window. "They hate me," he said flatly. Miss Carter, who had stayed in his life despite the broken system, sat at the table. "They hate that they can't understand you," she replied. "They don't know what to do with someone who sees more than they want to show." "I'm tired," he whispered, "of pretending I don't hear it, of being the other. I don't belong there." She didn't argue. She simply slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a printed acceptance letter. Full scholarship, STEM program, out of district, private, selective. "They accepted you, not the version you've been trying to shrink," she said. "I applied for you. You just had to keep going long enough to deserve it, and you have." Julian didn't say thank you. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because his throat had closed and he was afraid his voice might tremble. From then on, he studied harder, watched closer, spoke less. He began to understand that brilliance in a black boy didn't get applause, it got suspicion. That excellence, when wrapped in brown skin, was more often treated as a threat than a gift. So Julian adapted. He asked fewer questions, even when he knew the answers were wrong. He let others take credit, if it kept the spotlight away. He smiled when teachers assumed his name was Jamal. He memorized the sound of condescension and learned to absorb it. Because if the world wouldn't listen to him, he'd learn to listen to the world, better than anyone ever had. He wasn't silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he was preparing for the day they'd have to hear him. By 19, Julian Reed had become fluent in 2 languages, code and silence. He didn't drink, he didn't party. He barely spoke in class, unless spoken to. But behind his calm exterior was a storm of equations, simulations, and predictive systems that could read a market's pulse before it even stirred. The prototype was ready. A machine learning model that could forecast food shortages months in advance, based on shifting weather patterns, crop yields, and global trade fluctuations. It wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. The World Food Program had expressed interest. 2 professors at MIT were ready to co-author a white paper, and for the first time Julian thought, maybe I'm finally being seen. He wore his best shirt to the meeting, buttoned down, collar crisp, eyes alert. Across the polished oak table sat 3 men, all older, all white, all with smiles so polished they reflected back nothing at all. Bradley Winston was the one who led. Silver hair, perfect posture, voice like a commercial for confidence. "Julian," he said, as if they were old friends, "we've reviewed your proposal. Your algorithm is promising. Julian's fingers curled slightly under the table. "It's a bit rough," chimed in Andrew Phillips, glancing briefly at the printouts. "But with the right guidance and some real-world backing, it could go far." Julian nodded. He'd heard that tone before. The "we know better" tone. The "be grateful we're listening" tone. Winston leaned forward. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for the full rights and IP. Silence. Julian blinked once. 50,000? He kept his voice steady. The system had taken him 3 years to build. The projected value, conservatively, was in the millions. Phillips chuckled, like Julian had told a charming joke. "You're a student, no business background, no distribution. We'd be taking all the risk." "No," Julian replied. "You'd be taking the credit." For a moment, the smiles dropped. Just briefly. Then Winston put both hands on the table. "Look," he said, voice colder now. "This is how the game is played. We have connections, infrastructure. You have potential. That's not enough." Julian reached into his bag. He pulled out the prototype, tucked neatly in a reinforced case, and stood up. "I built this to help people, not to be flipped to hedge funds for profit." Winston's eyes narrowed. "Walk away from this, son, and we'll build our own. You think we need you? We'll reverse engineer whatever we need from your presentation, and you'll get nothing." Julian held the case tighter. He didn't yell, he didn't beg. Just one sentence: "I'd rather get nothing than sell everything." And he walked out. For 6 months he heard nothing. Then one day a press release hit the wires. Vanguard Innovations launches cutting-edge predictive analytics platform for agriculture aid. Julian clicked the link. The screenshots looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. The code had been copied, modified, masked, but unmistakably his. There were no lawsuits, no press coverage, no recourse. Because in that world, power owned truth. And Julian? He had none. But he did have memory. And something else too. A lesson etched so deep it rewired the way he trusted. Never again would he offer brilliance to people who only saw leverage. Never again would he walk into a room unarmed with strategy. That day, Julian stopped believing in opportunity, the way others did. From that moment on, he believed in positioning. Denver International buzzed with the usual choreography of a weekday morning. Business travelers rolling sleek luggage with practiced precision, families herding children toward security gates, the low murmur of flight updates blending into the scent of roasted coffee and disinfectant. Julian Reed stepped into the terminal like he had 1,000 times before. Custom Tom Ford suit. Minimalist carry-on. Platinum cufflinks glinting under the overhead lights. He moved like a man who belonged anywhere, especially here. But belonging was a fragile thing. People looked up, then away. Not with fear, not with hostility. Just that subtle, trained reflex. The kind that said, don't stare, but also, don't engage. He caught a pair of curious eyes near gate 23, a little girl in pink sneakers. She smiled, wide and unfiltered, the way children do before the world teaches them otherwise. Julian softened. He gave a small nod, but the moment was brief. Her mother, mid-30s, professional white, glanced up, saw the man her daughter was smiling at, and instantly, instinctively, drew the child close by the arm. She didn't frown, didn't scowl, just tightened her grip and whispered something low. The girl's smile vanished, replaced by confusion. Julian looked away. He wasn't offended. He wasn't even surprised. It was a dance he knew by heart, one passed down not through malice, but through inheritance. At the first-class check-in counter, Linda Rose stood behind the polished desk, tapping rhythmically at her keyboard. Mid-50s, stiff posture. Not unfriendly, just particular. The kind of employee who measured professionalism in tone and posture, and the kind who'd already decided what first class should look like. Julian approached with a nod. "Good morning," he said, offering his ID and boarding pass. Linda took them without smiling. Her eyes lingered on his face, then on the name. "Mr. Reed," she said slowly. Then, after a pause too long to be casual, "And, are you traveling for business or pleasure today?" "Business." A faint raise of her eyebrow. "I see." She glanced at the boarding pass again, then back at him. "Are you sure this was purchased for you?" The words hung in the air, wrapped in politeness, but sharpened by doubt. Before Julian could answer, a voice from behind broke the moment. "Coach is that way, bro." Came the snide chuckle of a man in golf khakis, pointing down the corridor, without even looking at him. A few others laughed, the nervous kind. Not quite cruel, but not innocent either. Julian didn't turn around. He simply reached into his wallet and placed a black American Express Centurion card on the counter. That mythical sliver of metal most people only heard rumors about. Linda hesitated. Her eyes flickered to the card, then back to him. Her fingers tapped again on the keyboard, slower this time. Julian stood perfectly still, expression neutral, pulse calm. But inside, a quiet reckoning stirred. Not anger, not outrage. He'd burned through those emotions years ago. This wasn't the first time someone questioned whether he belonged. Wasn't the first time a woman like Linda asked if the seat had been gifted to him. Wasn't the first time his skin was seen before his credentials. But something was different now. This time, he wasn't that boy at St. Gabriel's, holding his tongue. He wasn't that young man walking out of a boardroom empty-handed after being robbed of his invention. This time, he was Julian Reed, with leverage, with reach, with memory, and with a plan. So when Linda, stiff-lipped, picked up the phone and said, "I'm going to need a security supervisor," Julian didn't blink, didn't sigh. He simply looked out the window toward the tarmac, as if already seeing beyond it, to what came next. Because deep down, he knew, they weren't just questioning his boarding pass. They were about to question their whole definition of power. Andre Hill wasn't supposed to be watching. He'd only stepped into the hallway near gate B27 to grab a water before logging baggage data. But through the lounge glass, he saw the man in the tailored navy suit. He saw Linda Rose standing stiffly at the counter. He saw the way her eyes narrowed, and the way security arrived, calm and casual, as if it were protocol. And he saw the man, tall, composed, silent, refused to flinch. Andre's heart skipped. It wasn't just the suit, not the calm. It was the face. He knew that face. Julian Reed, the mind behind ReedCore Systems, the man whose software powered the biometric gates across this very airport. A legend in every tech forum Andre had ever followed, a genius, a ghost, and now a target. Andre ducked into a quiet hallway and called someone he trusted. "Miles," he whispered, "you're on systems today, right?" "Yeah, why?" "Julian Reed is here, right now, in the terminal. Linda just tried to block him from the first-class lounge." There was a pause. "You're kidding." "I'm dead serious." Miles's voice dropped to a hush. "Do you know what that means?" "I think I'm starting to." Miles Jenkins sat in the Regalis IT office on the 3rd floor, fingers already flying across his keyboard. He pulled up the access logs. Everything looked clean, at first, but then he saw it. Julian's boarding pass had cleared every biometric check. No flags, no system issues, until a manual override. Someone had marked it flag for re-verification. No reason, no justification, just a digital shrug dressed as suspicion. Miles leaned back, breath catching in his throat. "This isn't a glitch," he muttered. "This is personal." And then slowly things began to change. First, a seat assignment vanished from the system. Then a first-class reservation inexplicably dropped to economy. A duplicate booking appeared for a gate that didn't exist. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would set off alarms, but just enough to rattle the machine. Miles checked the back end again. "Something's pulsing," he whispered, "like the system's being watched from inside." It didn't feel like a cyber attack. It felt like a message. Back downstairs, Andre stood at the edge of the concourse, watching passengers pass by without noticing the quiet storm unfolding beneath their feet. And for the first time in his life, he felt something stir inside. Not fear, not helplessness, but purpose. He'd grown up skeptical, told that justice was a fantasy, a slogan, a mask people wore before going back to business as usual. But now, he'd seen what injustice looked like up close, and he'd seen who it tried to silence. Maybe this was his moment. Maybe, just this once, silence wasn't survival, it was surrender. Across the airport, emails misfired, gate assignments shuffled. Elite members were asked to verify their identity twice. Tiny, calculated malfunctions, like grains of sand dropped into a perfectly greased machine. And no one knew where it started. But Andre knew. And Miles suspected, and somewhere in the system, beneath the blinking cursors and cold steel gates, a quiet kind of resistance had begun. Not loud, not reckless, but deliberate, and growing. It began not with a bang, but with a brief, coded phrase spoken into a secured line. "Eclipse Phase 2 is a go." Leah Omari ended the call without another word. She stood in a windowless room, lit only by the blue glow of monitors, each displaying live data from Regalis Airways' internal systems. To the world, she was the head of global security at ReedCore. But before that, Leah had been a CIA intelligence analyst, the kind who didn't just track threats. She anticipated them. Most people at ReedCore didn't trust her when she joined. Too cold, too secretive, too dangerous. But Julian Reed, he didn't hesitate. "You've seen systems collapse from the inside," he told her. "Now I want you to help me rebuild one from the outside." That was 4 years ago. Now, with Protocol Eclipse active, Leah was doing what she did best, building a case so airtight it would collapse Regalis from its foundation. In a secure underground server farm in Virginia, Leah's hand-picked team of cyber investigators combed through encrypted archives, and what they found was rot. 17 internal reports of racial profiling by Regalis staff, all buried. 12 sexual harassment complaints filed by female flight attendants, all settled quietly with NDAs. 3 near-miss flight safety incidents never reported to the FAA, because doing so would have triggered mandatory inspections. And then came the offshore accounts. Millions quietly funneled into shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Wire transfers routed through Luxembourg, then scrubbed clean. Each file digitally time-stamped, each signature traceable. Leah looked at the evidence building on her screen and said aloud, "They didn't just look the other way. They built an empire on silence." Across the country, the first leaks had already begun. A short video clip hit Twitter at 6:42 a.m. Eastern. It showed Julian Reed standing calmly as security guards escorted him out of the Regalis first-class lounge. The caption read, "Black CEO blocked from lounge, built the system they're using to deny him." Within minutes, it had 10,000 retweets. By noon, major outlets picked it up. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Reed was right, fly while black, systemic on display. But Leah didn't care about hashtags. She watched the patterns. Corporate accounts from Regalis HQ began locking down. Their crisis PR teams scrambled for statements. Isolated incident. Committed to inclusion. Under investigation. But the internet had stopped listening. Because this wasn't just about one man in a lounge. It was about the accumulated weight of being told you don't belong. Even when you built the damn building. Meanwhile, in Regalis's glass tower in Atlanta, the CEO's office was unusually quiet. Charles Whitmore sat at his desk, watching the news crawl across the bottom of the screen. He took a sip of whiskey that didn't calm his nerves. Then his phone buzzed. "Sir, we have an issue," said his legal advisor, voice low. "What kind of issue?" "Someone has accessed sealed HR records, and there's chatter that a federal inquiry is incoming." Whitmore stood, not in panic, in rage. "Leak our statement. Fire someone. Do whatever it takes. Contain this." But outside that glass tower, the world was already listening. And inside the code, something was waking up. Leah leaned over her tablet, reviewing the deployment map. Phase 3 would follow. But Phase 2 was already doing its work. Not with fire, not with noise, but with facts. Because the truth once seen couldn't be unseen. And when systems designed to ignore the truth finally came face to face with it, they didn't push back, they cracked. Julian Reed didn't like public meetings. He preferred strategy rooms to spotlight, data to drama. But this meeting wasn't about headlines, it was about legacy. Diane Beckford greeted him in the private boardroom at the top of the Civic Tower, overlooking Washington, D.C. Still elegant, still sharp, still the woman who 20 years ago shattered the glass ceiling as the first black female CEO of a major airline. She poured them both coffee without asking. Her style had never changed, warm but precise. "I saw the headlines," she said, finally taking a seat across from him. "Regalis is bleeding out, and they say you're holding the knife." Julian didn't respond. She tilted her head. "Is this about retribution, Julian?" He let the question hang in the silence, not avoiding it, just letting it breathe. Then, softly, "They erased people like me for generations, ignored our resumes, questioned our boarding passes, stole our ideas and repackaged them with lighter faces. But this," he continued, voice calm but firm, "this isn't about destroying them." He looked out the glass wall at the city beyond. "It's about making sure no one else has to start where I did." Diane leaned back, watching him. "You were always the quiet kind," she said. "But even back then, I knew you were listening to everything." Julian smiled, a rare softness in his face. "I was listening to you." She folded her arms, curious now. "So what's your plan?" "Reed Corp will acquire controlling interest, 51% of Regalis Airways," Julian said. "Not to gut it, not to gloat, but to rebuild it from the inside out." He tapped his tablet. A graph appeared. 28,000 jobs. We'll protect them, modernize operations, tear out the culture that allowed systemic bias to root itself in every hallway. Diane raised an eyebrow. "And the board?" "Half of them are already wavering. The rest will follow when the SEC subpoenas start rolling in." "And what happens to Charles Whitmore?" Julian paused. "I don't care where he ends up. This was never about him." Silence fell between them. Not awkward, but weighted. Then Diane nodded slowly. "You didn't grow up to get even." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "You grew up to lead." Julian met her gaze. "I grew up to rewrite the rules. Because power used right wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. Not about burning bridges, but building roads where none existed before." And now, for the first time, he wasn't walking alone. 4:03 a.m. Eastern Time. The mainframe at Regalis Airways flickered, then dropped into darkness. At LAX, boarding passes refused to scan. At JFK, gate agents rebooted their terminals and waited. In Dallas, flight crews stood idle beside grounded planes, watching passengers grow restless. Within minutes, across the nation, screens froze mid-check-in. Reservation data vanished. Baggage tracking links failed. The entire digital backbone of Regalis Airways had vanished beneath their feet. By 4:17 a.m., the ripple turned into a wave. Social media erupted. "Regalis down, the empire's cracking, fly while black." Then came the leaks, screenshots, emails, A headline pinned to the top of every trending feed: "The reckoning is now." In the corner office of Regalis HQ, Charles Denham sat wide-eyed, jaw tight, watching chaos unfold across 4 muted monitors. His assistant entered, trembling. "Sir, there's an email sent to the entire executive team." She handed him the page, printed and shaking slightly in her grip. Charles read, "To Regalis Executive Suite, subject, the reckoning is now. This collapse was coded years ago by the man you tried to erase." He threw the paper down. "Who the hell is doing this?" Before she could answer, his laptop screen flickered, then stabilized. A video call launched on its own. No one touched a key. Julian Reed appeared on screen, backlit by morning haze, calm and centered in a simple, undecorated office. Charles stiffened. "You," he muttered. "This is your doing." Julian didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward. He simply looked straight into the camera, eyes steady as stone. "You saw a black man in a suit," he said quietly, "and assumed he didn't belong. You thought you could erase him." A pause. "You didn't know he built the code beneath your empire." Charles stood from his chair, pacing, voice cracking with fury. "We've lost millions already, stocks dropping by the second. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Julian didn't blink. "You did this to yourself. You ignored safety reports, silenced complaints, taught employees to discriminate, and called it instinct. You built a tower with hollow bricks, Charles. And now it's falling." Charles stared into the camera, his face pale, lips tight, hands shaking just enough to spill his whiskey onto the edge of the desk. "You're proud of this?" he hissed. "This destruction?" Julian's tone didn't change. "I warned your board 6 hours ago. They had time to redirect flights, ground schedules safely, notify passengers. But you dismissed it, like you've dismissed people like me for years." His voice hardened, just slightly. "This isn't destruction. This is exposure. This is your system facing the truth it buried." Behind Julian, one of the monitors lit up with live coverage, FBI agents walking into Regalis data centers, SEC attorneys confirming formal investigations, CNN anchoring a breaking headline: "The Regalis collapse may trigger historic industry reform." Julian glanced sideways, then looked back at Charles. "I don't need to bring your empire down," he said. "You already built it to fall." Then, softly, firmly, "I just stopped holding it up." The call ended. Charles stared at the screen, the empty space where Julian had been. No more words, no one to blame but himself. Outside the tower, morning sunlight sliced through the clouds, catching the edge of the Regalis logo that glinted atop the building. By nightfall, that logo would come down. But this wasn't just the end of a name. It was the end of an era, one built on silence, denial, and unchecked power. And somewhere else in the city, Julian Reed stood quietly, watching the sky lighten. He hadn't burned a bridge, he'd cleared the rubble. And now, he was laying the foundation for something that would last. 3 months after the collapse of Regalis Airways, a new name lit up the sky, sleek, bold, radiant against the clouds. Nova Air. The press called it a rebrand. But those who knew the truth understood. This wasn't cosmetic. This was a resurrection. The launch event drew thousands. Airport staff, families, former skeptics, all gathered on the tarmac of Washington National, where the storm had first begun. At the center stood Julian Reed, no longer just a tech mogul, now the architect of a new aviation standard. He stepped up to the podium. No notes, no teleprompter, just his voice. Calm, low, certain. "We're not launching a new airline today," he began. "We're launching a new standard. One that says dignity isn't a privilege, it's a promise." Applause rolled like thunder. Nova means new, but this isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it. It's about building something that finally reflects all of us. Then he turned slightly, gesturing toward a young man waiting near the stage. "Please welcome someone who reminded me what courage looks like when it's still learning to speak." Andre Hill stepped up, visibly nervous, holding a folded piece of paper, then decided to speak from the heart. "The day I saw Mr. Reed get escorted out of that lounge, something broke in me," he said. "I always thought being quiet meant being safe, but that day I realized silence isn't safety, it's surrender." He looked out over the crowd, and for the first time his voice didn't shake. "Nova Air isn't just where we fly, it's what we believe. And I believe it's time the skies belong to everyone." Leah Omari stood just off stage, watching with pride. Once labeled too dangerous, too sharp, too direct, now Chief Operating Officer of Nova Air. And not far from her, seated in the front row, was Erica Monroe, the gate agent who once stood up when others stayed silent. Today, she wore a new name badge, Director of Passenger Experience. Because courage doesn't care what color your skin is. It only asks, will you speak when it matters? Later that evening, long after the cameras were gone, Julian stood alone beneath the soft oaks of Green Hill Cemetery. He knelt at the weather-worn headstone of Miss Carter, the social worker who first saw brilliance in a grieving orphan boy with a notebook full of graphs. He placed a small envelope against the stone. Inside, a letter. Simple, honest. You were right. We didn't need revenge. We needed vision. That night, Julian boarded the inaugural flight of Nova Air, a sleek new jet humming with promise, ready to cross a sky that had once felt like a ceiling. As he settled into seat 1A, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reed." He looked out the window, the stars beginning to scatter across the dark like code waiting to be written. He smiled gently. "Feels like I finally arrived." If this story touched you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. This wasn't just about a fall. It was about rising with purpose, about turning silence into strength and pain into progress. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories that spark change, inspire hope, and remind us all that everyone deserves to belong. Thanks for being part of the journey. We're Mr. Mac's Stories, where voices rise and truth is heard.